Hello, this is Dr. Jamie Mathias, Executive Director of MASBA, the Mexican American School Boards Association. Welcome to our MASBA Aprendamos webinar series, where we're learning about a variety of topics. Today's focus is on developing our bilingual learners. As you know, MASBA has a special mission of closing gaps in our Texas public schools, with a special focus on the Latino students who comprise the majority in our Texas public schools and the English language learners who are expected to be 20% of our public schools now in 2020. Today we have two doctoral students from the University of Texas at Austin, Julia Hernandez and Patricia Nunez Porres, who are working on their studies in the departments of Education Policy and Leadership and in Cultural Studies. Welcome, Julia and Patricia.
Good morning.
Good morning. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you for having me.
Glad to have you all launch in and tell us all about developing bilinguals.
Great. What we'd like to do today is share some information with you regarding the strengths of our developing bilinguals. And we want to do this through the information on the history of bilingual programs in the state of Texas, as well as dual language programs. So as you can see, the objectives for today will be to just take a brief look at what has bilingual education looked like in Texas, as well as this understanding of who are developing bilinguals and what are we needing to do as educational institutions to really describe the strengths and brilliance of our students and leverage these for academic achievement. So we're going to look at the goals from HB3, and we're also going to take a look at what does effective bilingual programming look like in our schools. As we know, 34.4% of the students in Texas speak a language other than English, with 83% of those students speaking Spanish. And what we want to do is leverage what our students bring from home, what the students bring from families, and take advantage of that to really give them a robust opportunity in our educational settings. So what this turned out to look like in the 70s through the 80s in our bilingual program education, we established bilingual programs where the advocacy piece was to have some part of instruction during the day in Spanish. But what occurred is that Spanish was used as an academic language of instruction to transition students to English. It was a stepping stone to English, with the goal still being English for all of our students. And what that has led to, and what we see in the research, is that it leads to this deficit, the narrative about what is an English language learner. And what we see in a lot of the research and a lot of the studies today is that our students with this label are not able to be perceived with their strengths that a multilingual or a bilingual student bring into the classroom. We are not able to see that as additive, as what the students brings. So it leads to not being able to see our students as readers, as writers, as agentic students. And we tend to develop dependent learners as opposed to students who are independent in their learning. Because what these labels do, the labels of dominant language, they're non-speaker, a student being labeled as L1, as English language learner. What we see that label being translated into is a student that is at risk. In fact, a lot of our guidelines place this at-risk label on all students who come from language diverse backgrounds. And what this tends to do is that it gives the student a limited or a differentiated instruction that does not build an independent learner identity, an academic identity, and a sound identity, just as a civic contributor to our community and to society. What we realize is that language is not neutral. So when we use the language, it's very, very important that we understand who our students are.
Mm-hmm. And in addition to that, that we push back and think about the labels that are used to describe our students, what are the implications of those and how we speak about them, right? And so when we take a closer look at the students that we're serving across Texas who are identified as English language learners, we find that they're not Spanish speakers or English speakers. We find that they are, as bilinguals, there's different kinds of bilinguals. And here in the state of Texas, we find that we have students who are bilingual who are simultaneous bilinguals, and those who are described as sequential bilinguals. And when we take a closer look at what simultaneous bilinguals are, these are children who the majority are born in the US, and therefore they are being exposed to English by the mere fact that they are born here, right? So in their home, while another language is spoken like Spanish, because we know that English, we are in an English-driven society, that they are exposed to English as well. Therefore, they are simultaneous bilinguals. So growing up, being exposed to multiple languages at once, right? And this would be from the age 0 to 5 or 3 to 5. We also have students that we serve in our schools who are described as sequential bilinguals. And these are children who are exposed or are dominant in or know one language, and then after the age of 3 or the age of 5 are exposed or then begin to add another language such as English to their repertoire. And so these would be students that we have in our schools who we tend to identify them as newcomers, where they are born and have grown up in a different, for example, a Spanish-speaking country, and then come into our schools here in Texas, where after that first day in our school, we are then adding English language acquisition or instruction through English to their linguistic repertoire. When we look at the data across Texas and across the nation, we find that the majority of the students that we're serving are those who are simultaneous bilinguals. More and more, the data is showing that, for example, what we see here, 85% of our children are born in the US, being exposed to English, as well as the other language that they speak in their home, and therefore being simultaneous bilinguals. And so there's students who have a rich linguistic repertoire of multiple languages. And so how can we leverage that in our schools for their academic success? So we're going to look at that a little further.
So what this graph demonstrates is this tremendous shift that has occurred in our country regarding students who are developing bilinguals, that so many of the students being US born and being simultaneous bilinguals, what we need to do is leverage this bilingualism. And bilingual education program has now shifted to leveraging the fact that these students have some resources in both of their languages throughout and bring that with them in their schooling. I think you see it throughout the entire United States. I think here in Texas, we think of Spanish as the other language, but in other programs where you see Portuguese develop, where you see Polish, there's a really strong program in Chicago with Polish and English communities. And what we understand now is when we have the students take advantage of these two languages that they've been exposed to, we can leverage that for high academic learning. That there's been so many misconceptions around bilinguals and their use of language, the way that bilinguals mix languages, use different phonetic systems of all the languages they know to make sense of literacy, to make sense of their abilities when they're reading, etc. So what we want to do is, as educators, take advantage of that. We recognize that in Texas, we have a great number of simultaneous bilingual students, that most of our students, in some areas, 90% of our students identified as Ls are actually simultaneous bilinguals. So we want to begin literacy instruction in both of their languages, so that they're able to develop both languages simultaneously. Which brings us to this question: is more English earlier better? And what we know, and what a vast amount of research has shown, is that more English instruction doesn't necessarily lead to higher achievement or language proficiency. What it does lead to is less of proficiency in the partner language, right? And the actual loss, in some cases, of the partner language. So while we have students that are entering our school system as bilinguals, not balanced bilinguals, they might have systems, phonetic systems that are more developed in one than another, or they use both in combination. But the fact is that these students could really take both languages and leverage them for academic advantage. And we see a lot of those studies that are coming out, how when students are able to take advantage of their both linguistic systems, they're able to really achieve high levels of academic proficiency. And there's lots of research. We have research that's come out from UT Texas on students in high school and students in college that have tracked their language use. So I think that it's worthy to dig into the more recent research, because what we have from the 80s and 90s is no longer applicable to the students in our schools today.
Mm-hmm.
Julia, do you want to talk about the program?
Mm-hmm. So as Patricia mentioned, as we're having this demographic shift in who we're serving in our schools, which are simultaneous bilinguals who are developing bilinguals, then it's important for the academic program structure or framework to shift as well to appropriately serve them and take advantage of the resources that they bring as tools for learning, like Patricia has mentioned. And when we look at bilingual education programs, we find that dual language education, dual language programs, one way or two way, is the program that does this. And as we look closer to dual language, what we find is that the goals for dual language is for students to develop high levels of bilingualism and biliteracy, for students to develop high academic achievement in both of their languages, and because that is what leverages their cognitive ability for academic success. And as we look at dual language program goals and we identify that this is what we know is best and what we want to implement, then it's important to consider how are we going to achieve that. And Chapter 89, as dual language being one of those programs options, gives us requirements that if we are to implement dual language, how will we get there? And so what Chapter 89 tells us is that for an effective dual language program, it has to be a kinder through 5th grade implementation, and that at least 50% minimum of the instructional time has to be in that target language. in that language other than English, it being, for example, Spanish. That students have the opportunity instructionally to read, to write, to speak in that target language to be able to achieve those high levels of biliteracy and bilingualism. And that there has to be strategic language separation, instructional time allotted for English as well, just as instructional time allotted for that target language.
So what we see in this Thomas and Collier graph is a long-term achievement of English reading by students who are identified as English language learners in low SES category. These are standardized tests, right? And we use English because those are most of the states in the in the country have their standardized test in English. There's 2 states with that exception, Texas, and I think now New Mexico. But what we see here is, regardless, if you look to the right, you see the different bilingual program models. You see that there's 2 under enrichment models, and then the rest fall under remedial models. So the 2-way dual language programs are considered enrichment, and you have 2-way and you have 1-way. 2-way is usually characterized by having students who come from 2 different home languages and are come together in one classroom to receive content instruction throughout the day in both languages. A 1-way program is usually students of a minoritized language who are also receiving instruction in English and are together all day to receive instruction in the target language and English in content areas throughout their day. And then we have the remedial models, the early exits, the late exits. Well, we have early exit because early exit is in elementary programs. You have content-based ESL, ESL pullout, and students who receive no services. And this graph shows clearly that we're not going to see any difference between the programs probably until 3rd grade, until the students attend 3rd grade. You see that most of the programs give the same data outcomes for the students' performance. Where you start to see the difference is in the 4th and 5th grade. You start to see that there's more separation in between what students accomplish for English reading performance. When we see the rest of the graph, what we see is that these students only attending dual language programs up to 5th grade, the trajectory that it sets them on is quite different. You see how the students in the 2-way enrichment models are able to reach the performance standards of native English speakers and surpass it, as opposed to the other bilingual programs where the students actually take a dip in their performance. What
I
we
think,
see. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I think that what we see here in terms of this data that's very much used in sharing about dual language education and its effectiveness, which is by Thomas and Collier, it also reflects what we tend to hear about students' academic performance in terms of this idea of an achievement gap. And we see that, like as Patricia mentioned, students only receiving dual language programming until 5th grade, the trajectory that it sent them on in a longitudinal aspect of it, which also goes, it aligns with the understanding that when we look when we think about language acquisition, that it takes 5 to 7 years, we see here where students are able to have that time in both languages in a dual language context, really then serves them to have that bilingual advantage for their academic schooling.
Right, right. Like time affords us that, right? This ability to really acquire language. And then considering that the dual language programs do not leave content behind. They're not language programs. They are programs that are about content, about academics. So the students are developing language as they are acquiring content, which I think is also a very strong, how can I say, aspect of doing dual language in our schools. I think that this data is also, again, represented and seen in the Texas Assessment Performance Reports that we get every year from Texas. And what you see here is how from 2017 to 2019 for the standardized test in all grades and all subjects, the difference between achievement from the dual language programs to the early transition programs. Although all programs are showing growth throughout the years, you see that there is a difference, whether it be 3 percentage points, 4 percentage points. We know that that equates to high number of students, that impacts lives. And we see this in all subject areas, but we also see it, especially important, in the ELA and reading performance reports. Julia, do you have anything to add? Mm-hmm.
And when we look at the different kinds of bilingual ed programs that the state of Texas allows for districts to implement, and we ask ourselves, well, what is the difference across these different bilingual ed programs? The main difference in dual language is that it is the only program, one-way or two-way, that does not discontinue Spanish, that doesn't discontinue that partner language, and that the paradigm that the students' linguistic practices are really viewed in an additive way, right? That it's the Spanish, for example, isn't just used as a crutch, as Patricia mentioned earlier. It's not used just as a stepping stone. It's worthy to use it's worthy to write in for an academic, to use it for academic learning, and it really has an impact in the students' affective domain, their linguistic domains as well, which we see here, the cognitive aspect as well, right? So there is a difference in terms of across these bilingual ed programs, what dual language does in comparison to the other bilingual ed programs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then going back to how we were differentiating our bilingual students today, as opposed to the bilingual students that we used to have, who are maybe more adequately described as newcomers, who we had brought in Spanish as the advocacy and equity piece in education. And we had programs that were structured in monolingual design and were monolingually normed, either for English or for Spanish. But regardless, none of these, monolingual Spanish design or monolingual Spanish norms, nor monolingual English design or monolingual English norms, fit who our students are. Our students are bilingual and biliterate from the very, very beginning. So they navigate the space between their two languages from the time they are developing language, developing ideas, and from the very, very beginning. What that led to was this gap, right? This kind of acceptance and this narrative of deficit, that the students have less words, that what families contribute are not, it is not meaningful or valuable in schooling, and that equating this idea that your proficiency in one language equals your cognitive ability. All of these are misunderstandings that are very much linked to developing simultaneous bilinguals, right? Simultaneous bilinguals, the students who again are labeled as non-English speaker, non-Spanish speaker, students who are low in both languages. And we've all heard these terms. We've all heard these terms when we're in bilingual education, and how they are used to address our students. The reality is that all of these have been debunked, and a lot of researchers spend a great deal of time debunking all of these types of research and studies, but they continue to be cited, they continue to be used for funding, in which our students are then caught in this cycle of, you know, intervention for their entire academic elementary career, where they are using given programs that are remedial in nature, right? Or we're using programs that are monolingual, either in English or in Spanish, but monolingual, and not realizing that some of the resources we're using have a deficit lens of our students when they talk about their students that lack exposure to literacy, lack exposure to experiences, and not realizing that what that sets our students in a experience, a schooling experience of intervention that really becomes a cycle, right? And then not, I think, you know, Julia spoke about the affect aspect of all the programs, and I think we can't negate how they impact how a student feels about themselves and their academic identity. If I was a student who, for my entire schooling, had to succumb to 60 minutes every day of intervention, where there's 11 activities per lesson, right? And where I'm being taught skills that are just about transferring to English, where English is the goal. There's no doubt that my identity as the person who I am, with the languages that I bring and the language use that I bring, that I'm going to feel less than capable, and it's going to impact how I feel about myself. Schooling becomes about closing the word gap, about skills, and about compliance, right? About being compliant, which creates a disengaged and dependent learner. And it doesn't take advantage of all of this brilliance that our kids bring with their language use, such as code switching, translanguaging, their ability to use both languages, and how we can leverage that in our instruction and teach to that. This, when we do this as teachers, when we take advantage and leverage the bilingualism, that is the cognitive advantage of being bilingual. This is where we talk about robust, well-implemented bilingual programs, dual language programs, bring the students to this point, where the student now recognizes, oh, this is how I'm using my Spanish. This is how I'm using my English. And when I use them and make contrast comparisons between the both, I'm able to leverage both of them. I think we can't negate, right, that whenever languages and cultures come into contact and interact with each other, that there's influences, right? We see them in our homes, in our schools, in our community, and by far in our students' identity. So we have to be able to rise up, and we have to be able to celebrate these identities that exist and are such great contributors to our community and our society. Julia, do you want to?
So what that Oh, it took me off. With that in mind, then we understand that regardless of our students who are identified or designated as ELs, if they are simultaneous or a sequential bilingual, that they are on their path as a developing bilingual, and that therefore we understand that they are not two monolinguals in one. That when we look at the bilingual brain, we don't have, you know, the languages that we speak separated, that they're together, that they're fluid, and that they support each other in terms of how the student is developing bilingually. Okay. I got kicked off, so.
Yeah, me too. So I'm not sure if my screen is being shared or not, to tell you the truth.
Oh, there it goes.
Do you see me now?
I see the screen now. Yes. Mhm. So there's
just fine. Thank you all.
I'm sorry.
We can see the screen just fine. It's looking tremendous.
Oh, okay, great. We weren't sure because we both got kicked out. Okay, great.
So it's important to think, with all of this in mind, it's important to think about then the structures and systems that are in place in our districts that support the students that we're serving, those that are designated as English language learners, to best leverage their linguistic skills for academic success. And so it's important to consider the assessments, the instructional practices, the resources, as Patricia mentioned earlier, as well as professional learning that our educators are receiving to appropriately serve our students. And so there's at the state level, at the district level, at our local level, there's always things that we can do. And when we take a look at the shift that Texas has recently taken in dual language, in bilingual ed programming, we find that Texas is recognizing the effectiveness of dual language. And we see that in this last legislative session that just passed. Patricia and I had the opportunity to be involved quite a bit in the development of HB3, which, as you may know, is a significant finance bill that came out of this last legislative session, HB3, where different allotments came out of that. And one of those being incentivizing dual language education, dual language programming, by having an allotment for dual language education, where students who are designated as ELs have an allotment, but also those who are participating in a two-way dual language program who are not identified as ELs. So we're shifting in a direction that supports dual language implementation, and that the state is doing explicit things to support those systems and structures to happen in our districts. We also find that what came out of HB3 was a requirement to set early childhood literacy and math plans to support literacy and math, literacy development, and math skills for our students, and taking a closer look at that for in our primary grades, so for our young students. And with that, what also is part of this is that while districts have to identify or set literacy plans for the primary grades where goals are set, it recognizes that for bilingual ed programs, you have the option to set different goals, different literacy goals for students who are in a bilingual program, because the state is also recognizing that biliteracy development looks different than literacy development just in one language. And so we're able to now set different goals for those in bilingual ed programs, where students who are developing bilingually don't have to be expected to reach the goals of a monolingual student. And with that as well, the state is, as you may know as well, the state is having educators as well as other stakeholders attend literacy academies. And Patricia and I have the opportunity as well to have conversations with TEA about biliteracy academies, about these literacy academies, and know that there is a biliteracy or bilingual component that will be a part of that to appropriately serve and address biliteracy development, and how students, therefore how students developing literacy in 2 languages at the same time is different, so that educators can design and deliver literacy instruction appropriately. Another shift that the state has done recently, as we all know this year, is the revised literacy TEKS. We have revised Spanish language.
Yeah, hold on. I think it's also worth mentioning there that TEA, in support of dual language program, also has and provides some rubrics for programs and their implementation. And we've been revising those as well, but they are online, they're available. And I think it's a really great place to start when looking at our programs and what we want to do moving forward, how we want to allocate these funds that are being given to us through HB3. And that they provide some very sound guidelines. Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
So here is just a section of HB3 in regards to the literacy plans that explicitly says bilingual programs may set separate goals, therefore addressing literacy development for bilingual students in a more appropriate manner. And then, as I mentioned, with the revised language arts TEKS, literacy TEKS, the state has shifted in recognizing the Spanish literacy, English literacy being different, that there are differences, and that leveraging both literacies for students is more advantageous, and that is explicitly addressed in the language arts, in the new language arts TEKS. So that is very promising and great to see with this new language, with these new revised literacy TEKS.
And we know that these changes came about because of the vast amount of research that is now being done nationally. As we know, dual language programs and bilingual programs are not new. They've been implemented in many places throughout our country for the last 25 or plus years. But what we see now is that there's a lot of research dedicated to it, a lot of guidance, a lot of data that we most likely didn't see before. We relied a lot on that monolingual data of Spanish literacy development separate from English literacy development. And what we're seeing now is that we have a lot of resources now that guide us in biliteracy development. So here is a few of the books that are available, some of them for teachers, some for in leadership also. But I think that this is a much better guide for where we are with our bilingual simultaneous learners than trying to structure our programs monolingually in one or the other language. Our students are developing both, so we want to start initial literacy instruction in both languages and support their use of both languages. Because what we want is to ensure equity. And this, by creating an ecosystem that supports those talents of bilingualism and biliteracy, and lets our students show up as who they are, their interests, their passions, then we are able to change what the educational experience is for students. But we need to become very, very well informed on how it is that simultaneous bilinguals use language to express themselves, to make sense of their world, to make sense of literacy in their world. And that way, we can shift this deficit narrative to a much more additive one and provide instruction that does create opportunities for just deep engagement and deep learning. Anything else, Julia, that you want to add that I didn't mention?
No, good.
I think we're ready for questions if there are any, or comments.
Tremendous. Julia and Patricia, thank you for opening our eyes. You know, at least for a trustee like myself who's been on our board for nearly 8 years, I really haven't thought so deeply on such distinguishing factors within the world of bilingual education, for instance, as the difference between simultaneous bilinguals and sequential bilinguals.
Right. I think that this is something that we still have a lot of work to do in terms of like informing our stakeholders in education.
Tremendous. And what might be the best resources? So I really appreciate the fact that you all are drawing our attention. We're going to come to a question by Trustee Willie Tenorio in just one moment. But my question becomes, you all have been talking about like more recent research. For those of you who are involved in the academic world, you're more privy to the research. Where would persons like ourselves as school board members and superintendents go to find what's the most recent research in this field?
Well, I think Thomas and Collier have, a set of books that are dedicated, like one is for administrators, one is for district superintendents, so they have a whole series of books for leadership. And then you have some top researchers like Lim Ho Leary, who also has done a lot of this research. I think Ramon Martinez is very important to this field because he really begs us to take a different a step back and look at how we are using the data that we get from our students in a much more additive and positive view. Julia, can you think of anybody else that what we can do is we can put together a reference sheet that we can share as well.
That would be tremendous. Julia?
The Center for Applied Linguistics is the site, and there's a lot of great information there as far as dual language education, and it houses research, it also houses resources, but it also provides, the last time I looked, there was webinars that one can also be a part of and register for. So the Center for Applied Linguistics, I think, is a great resource.
Tremendous. Appreciate that very much. We have a question from Trustee Willie Tenorio of the Hayes CISD. We'd like to try a new feature here. If it's all right with Trustee Tenorio, we'd like to unmute him to be able to ask his own question. We've never done that before on our webinars, but it'll give us a chance to be able to hear his voice. Awesome. Trustee Tenorio, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear y'all. Thank you.
Awesome.
My question was that at Hayes CISD, the bilingual one-way programs were changed to early exit. I fought the change, but I lost the fight. One of the arguments made to eradicate bilingual one-way was that dual language is a GT program and should only be offered to a few students. Can you speak to that? Because I didn't agree with that, but I just wanted to be able to counter that argument.
Yeah.
Right. I think that that is kind of a prevalent view of dual language and how it's more of an enrichment program than programs. But I think it's also just not being very familiar with how developing bilinguals use language, right? This idea that we were talking about, that you will use your two phonetic systems to spell in either language, that you will use words like puchar, right? You will use things that, you know, people consider, oh, they're mixing up, they're confused. They still need to, this idea that we need to develop one foundation language to then build another is what is the standard thinking in an early bilingual education. What we know today is that it's really students who are leveraging both of those languages that they have. And then we need to know, how can I take advantage of that? How am I going to teach to that? UT Austin also has a couple of resources and websites that help us as teachers understand, how can I contrast this aspect of English with this aspect of Spanish? And when we start doing that with students, we can really move them forward in their academic understanding. And I think that's what sometimes is lacking, this understanding that no, our students are more than capable of being able to participate, because you don't have to establish one language first. In fact, we don't want to. They already have two languages. They have several linguistic practices that we can take advantage of.
And in addition to that, I just wanted to add that as dual language is a bilingual program, it is one of the options as a bilingual ed program to implement, that it is, you know, it's a core academic program. It is not an enrichment or, you know, a program, as you mentioned, like 4GT, right? It's a core academic program that is what will serve the students best.
So dispelling this idea that language ability equals cognitive ability, and that language ability is tied to language proficiency in one language or another language. When you're not able to see, in fact, out of the University of California in Irving, there's now a biliteracy test assessment, right? Where it says no matter how the student is using their language, and this is for early childhood, but that we need to give the student credit if they say their colors as azul, yellow, rojo, verde, and purple. You know, that we're not going to say this student does not know their colors. We're going to say, oh, I need to notice as your teacher that I need to give you opportunities to learn colors in one language and then learn the colors in the other language as well. But I'm not gonna, in your assessment, I'm not gonna say not mastered because you didn't use it in the appropriate language. And I think that that's what has tended to happen. We assess in monolingual construct, it doesn't allow our students to show their strengths.
Tremendous. Thank you, Trustee Tenorio. We also have Lee Crenshaw from West ISD. Lee had a comment that she shared through the questions, through the comment box, and I seem not to be able to unmute her at the moment, so I'll just go ahead and read it. She was simply sharing her gratitude to us for the education that we are sharing that help persons like herself be able to ask meaningful questions in her district. So Patricia and Julia, thank you for helping to give us the vocabulary to be able to ask questions in our districts. Any concluding words here, Julia and Patricia?
No, I mean, I think thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you for what you as educators do for our communities and our children every day. And I think I speak for myself and Julia in saying that
Yes.
we're here for as to serve. So if we can help in any way, I know we're both available. Julia?
Yes. Thank you, Patricia, for that. And yes, I just want to say thank you and adelante.
Seguimos.
Gracias a las dos. Gracias, pero muchísimas gracias. Thank you all for sharing. We see your email addresses here on this slide as well for us to be able to follow up with y'all. What a tremendous presentation. Really appreciate the work that you put into it. I just want to say for all who are listening to us, the next webinars in our Más Aprendamos webinar series are going to be next Wednesday, April the 8th. We'll be hearing from retired Lieutenant Colonel Consuelo Castillo Kickbush, and also from Roy Juarez Jr., an advocate on homelessness. They've come up with an acronym, HOME, 4 different points on how it is that we can lead through difficult times. And also Joe Hendershot, Dr. Joe Hendershot will be with us next Friday, April the 10th at noon for a workshop on wounded students and wounded educators. Thank you all for being with us today y que pasen buenas tardes.
Igualmente, gracias.
Gracias.
Gracias.